Again, good morning. Thank you very much for opportunity to be here. And this is quite a significant time in terms of changes that are happening. So as an organisation, in terms of Environment Canterbury, we're quite keen to hear what the questions are from people as well. So certainly look forward to hearing those as well. Just in terms of a bit of context in terms of who I am, I'm the zone manager for the central area of the region that covers Selwyn, Christchurch, West Melton and Banks Peninsula. So have the responsibility for the compliance staff and our land management and biodiversity staff that are operational. So this topic is quite important to us. What I first of all wanted to just touch on in terms of before we talk about the 190 fertiliser cap is obviously it forms part of a wider package that has been released by central government in terms of the essential freshwater package. And I first of all just wanted to touch on that there's several components to that. One in terms of new national policy statement elements, which I will touch on a little bit just to give you some context that relates to this 190. And then there's the national environmental standards or regulations, which the 190 cap fits underneath. The reason I wanted to first of all just touch on the national policy statement is that is the new framework which alongside the cap also sets out new expectations in terms of in-stream and other outcomes that councils...
Sorry, could you get your microphone a bit closer? Just that one, yeah.
Yeah, is that better?
Thank you.
Yeah, cool. So the national policy statement, the reason I wanted to just draw it to your attention briefly, as I'll come back to the context shortly, but that sets the new outcomes that councils then need to work towards in terms of setting revised limits. So it's quite important, but the really key component that I wanted to also highlight is it brings in a new hierarchy for decision making for the council. So it sets out now, instead of a decision-making framework which has been traditionally looking across all the well-beings, it sets a hierarchy where the health and the well-being of water bodies and ecosystems becomes first, then the health and needs of people, then followed by community providing for their social and economic and cultural health. So it changes the context quite a lot, and that is something that the council is having to work through in terms of what does that mean if you are applying for something like for a resource consent. The other component which the 190 relates to that we're talking about today is in terms of those national environmental standards and regulations. And these come into effect that they work like our rules and they sit alongside our regional rules, so both of them apply. So some of the questions that have been out there early on is, are people, because there's so many rules out that Environment Canterbury's already done, like the farming land use rules, do you need to actually also meet the regulations? And the clear answer on that is yes. We've been working through, obviously looking at the implications, and we're still trying to understand them in more detail, but the rules do apply, ours and the regional regulations alongside one another. So we've worked out that there's no overlap, the both of them have to apply. So whatever anyone reads in the regulations, like the 190 cap, also applies alongside any rules we might have around farming activities. As saying, we're working through the implications, as Virginia had kind of indicated. She puts the challenge forward each time in terms of getting more certainty from us. It's an interesting situation for us though, because these regulations are national regulations, so we have to work through, it's a central government rule. Our responsibility is to obviously implement those and also follow up and monitor them, but we also have to look across the rest of the country and saying, well, how are we all actually approaching it as well. A couple of key things when getting more specific on the 190 cap is that one of the things that, as I said before, that we have determined is that there's no overlap, so yes, people do need to apply for that quite separately. The other one to clarify as well is the date in terms of when the requirement comes in is July 2021 next year, but we have determined as well that if someone finds themselves in the situation where they need to apply for a consent because they can't meet that on that date, then they have 6 months in which to apply for that consent. So that date in terms of when the consent would need to be applied for is the 31st of December next year. One of the other things that Virginia touched on, because we had a bit of a conversation about this a couple of weeks, and she's got it right up there, is the non-complying activity status as well. So to give you a bit of context in that, we sort of, I suppose, phrase in terms of if anyone's applying for a non-complying activity, it wouldn't usually get granted unless there's exceptional circumstances. So it is something to be aware that Virginia touched on in terms of that it is quite a hard test. Those rules do set out quite clearly 2 pathways and what's expected of that, so that an action plan is actually done, and then the cap is reached by, I think it's 2023, and then the second one is, or they can demonstrate that that it's not going to have basically no more effect than what would be operating at 190. So just be aware that is really a high test in that space. Otherwise, for us in the next wee while, we'll be working through the specifics that Virginia touched on in terms of what does that look like in terms of how will people actually have to report, and then thinking as well for the likes of staff how we will actually follow up and monitor those activities as well to ensure people are actually meeting the requirements. And that's no different than what you see from us as a council at any time when we make decisions about how we actually follow up and monitor on farm. But otherwise, as I say, keen for, we have got on the website, I meant to mention that if you go onto Environment Canterbury's website, you'll find a banner that has got a heading about essential fresh water. If you click on that, we've got a whole host of Q&As up there as well, and there's a whole section on the 190 cap. So do have a look at that. That will cover some of the things I've touched on this morning, but we are also keen to hear what other questions you have so that we can make sure we keep those Q&As alive and answering questions as best as possible, so do let me know.
Do we have any questions today for Tammy, or any clarifications on the regulations, either the 190 or any of the other ones? Yeah, Chris?
Thank you for that. Just your interpretation on contiguous landholding. So for an example, question is land that's in different titles, but it's actually immediately across the road.
I'd have to look at the exact way it's actually phrased, but we already have that phrase in our rules anyway when it comes to the farming land use consents. So unless the definitions are slightly different, then we'd continue to interpret it the same way in terms of, but I'm not into the detail of the specifics underneath that, how it actually, the devil is so often in the detail.
Hi, so more about winter grazing at 190, I hope that's all right, but and I just like to make a point, and I'm not having a go at you because I know that we're all living with this, and it's been sort of put upon us, but we run a biological system and it's got a very long lead time. So I'm thinking about my winter grazing for 2022 and 23 now, not, come when I may get a consent or may not get a consent. And when I can't even apply for it until the 31st of May next year. So I just, there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and it kind of goes to animal welfare, right? Like we've got animals that need to be fed, and I know you don't know the answers, it's all been put on you too, but I just really like to emphasise that point that it's quite difficult to figure out what we can do to feed our cows next winter. And I'd also like to make the point, I don't know what the outcomes are. There's very prescriptive rules around it. We have to have plant backs by the 1st of October. So I stood in my field on the 28th of September this year with a howling nor'wester, and a very nice paddock was prepared with a hard cap, and made a video which basically said I can't touch this paddock. If I cultivate this in any way, it's going to blow away. So what is the implication for me? If I think I've got everything right, and then because it's a biological system and I'm working with nature, the right answer there was to not plant back by the 1st of October, because if I touched that paddock, soil would be fine, it would blow away. But I've breached some rule trying to target another objective. So also just an issue to flag for you to think about, how those sort of situations are dealt with, because it's quite a dynamic environment that we're working in, and very prescriptive rules are kind of not always easy to meet. So sorry, they're not really questions, but they're just sort of some thoughts I'd like to pass on. Because sort of some of the things we're struggling with as we try and interpret all of this, which I'm sure you are too.
Yeah, and it's appreciated in terms of, and I think it's good to keep reinforcing in terms of that we provide that clarity sooner rather than later. Those that, there's a couple of other staff here today, we continue to reinforce that back in Environment Canterbury as well. In terms of about, the judgments you have to make, and then the follow-up in terms of how we address compliance is no different than what we do already, in terms of we obviously take into account what the situations have been and what people are have been trying to actually achieve, and then work through what the most appropriate approach is there. So it's not like our actual follow-up in terms of how we address something is going to change. It's still that same sort of thing. We've just got new requirements, and it is different for all of us. We, as Environment Canterbury, we had been working up quite a framework that was more an outcome-based one, and now we've got more of a, so it's quite a shift for us to work through as well.
Tammy, on that, the same, for example, with the 190 cap, there are some seasons where we actually need more than others. So I'm wondering if there is any, and it may not be something you can answer really, but just probably putting it out there. Is there any flexibility on that, just responding to what's happening, in the different seasons, the growing conditions, yeah.
I suppose I'll put it back that we're no different from yourselves in some ways. I mean, those regulations in terms of we have to implement the national regulations. So, we have to read them as they are and implement them as they are. So, yeah. But those will be obviously, it then comes down to in terms of if someone is actually in breach, how we actually follow up and deal with those breaches as well. And that's where we get the discretion to actually look at the actual circumstances that exist.
I think the main point would be is, will there be any flexibility?
So they can hear at the back. Yeah.
So in a season where it really is against everyone, will there be any flexibility, say, in the 1st of November? In that and with the 190 cap, will that change?
Well, as I said, the regulations as they are, and we have to implement the regulations as they're written, and they're written as that cap and everything.
Yeah, but then doesn't it come down to your interpretation of that as well?
There's not much room for interpretation. It comes down to actually how we then enforce it. So it's the conversation about, well, what was the circumstance? How did someone go through their thinking? And actually, is it something that we need to take further or not? But we're the same as you. We have to read them and they're quite clear, and then apply them as they're written.
There is information on these regulations in many websites. I try to go to the Minister for the Environment website myself and read a few things there, but tend to be a bit longish. So it's a few other websites where things are translated into more pharma language. One example, ECAN has quite a bit of information, but also we are all the time updating our website and just trying to keep it a little bit simpler to understand some of the policy jargon. So that's our kind of a place to go there. We will move now quickly into the actual how-to, I guess. We have the regulations. There's still a few things to sort it out. But we know we need to start acting now, so we're kind of going to really move into that now. Just I have 2 or 3 slides in terms of what is actually the situation in Canterbury. This graph was produced by our economic team from data from database and using a few other parameters just to estimate how many farms are likely to be above the 190 across the country. Not surprisingly, Canterbury there has the higher percentage of farmers. That's 50% of farms in Canterbury are using more than 190. And on average, those farms are exceeding 190 by 59, 60 kilos. So just to put things into perspective. Another point to think here is this data comes from a database, and it's an average of nitrogen across effective hectares of the farm. So not quite what we need to achieve, which is on every hectare. So this is, we still, even farms that are under 190 may still have to do some changes because they're not 190 under every hectare. Just if we look at this is the average of, again, same thing, nitrogen. But all of these graphs are on the handout. Unfortunately, it was printed not in color, so for some of the graphs it's a little bit tricky, but I'm sure they will be on the website in color at some point. But anyway, so this data is for Canterbury, the average of nitrogen use for the last 12, 13 years. And actually it hasn't changed much. What we can see there is probably a response to seasonal variations. Last year, for example, 18-19 was 234, and then last year, 19-20 was 223, the average across all of these farms in Canterbury, the ones we have on our database. In 10-11, clover root weevil came in, so we did, or many farms did use a little bit more nitrogen. We don't see that kind of a significant trend on the numbers there, but anyway, just interesting to understand what had happened. Another thing that I wanted to share, and some of you probably have seen this information because we have presented in it 2 or 3 places already, but this is a sample of the partner farms that we are working with under the Hines and Selwyn project. So these farms are in Hines or in Selwyn catchment. And just showing the change in nitrogen. This is nitrogen fertilizer. The numbers are the different farms. And the green bars are the baseline period, which was 2009 to 2013, an average from that. And then is the latest year end we had available. And basically, just to show you a bit of what has happened, I mean, that on average, those farms had dropped from 244 to 218. So that process of reducing nitrogen use has happened, and we do have a few examples of people doing that quite successfully. It's only 4 farms now, I think it's 4, that are under 190. Sorry, the wrong one. And again, this information comes from overseer, which is total hectares, not effective hectares, and also is the total average for the farm. So again, not exactly quite what we need to achieve. So that's kind of from a regional point of view. At a farm level, what's the impact of this reduction, I guess, and this is probably quite obvious. One would be, number one is what's the level of nitrogen that we are applying now. The size of the reduction is quite crucial to determine the impact. What is the current use efficiency of the nitrogen that we are applying currently? And Ants is going to go into the details of really how do we do that well. And then the other very important thing that we found is how the transition period from what we are using now to where we need to be, how do we manage that? And one thing that we have observed with the farmers that we've been working with is that the first drop, like if you are a high nitrogen user and moving the first step to say 330 to 280, the impact on the farm is not significant because it's likely that the nitrogen we were using hasn't been as efficient as it could be, not saying in all cases, but at the high levels, more likely to be some inefficiencies there. Then when we get to the next step, 280 to 230, some special care is required, and sometimes changes in management is required because we're likely to be growing less grass, so we have to ensure that we improve, pasture management and everything, so we can actually harvest as much as possible, even if we are growing a little bit less. And then, and some of you may have a different opinion on this. This is really our observations on working with these farmers. The last bit here, so the last 30, 40 kilos, we could think, oh, that's actually not that easy, that difficult. I'm using 220, 230, should be easy to drop. Sometimes it's not that simple because what I was saying before, the changes in seasons, sometimes 20 or 30 kilos is what we need to respond to a season. And we may actually need to make some adjustments in our system, even that is not that much what we are needing there to reduce. So again, this is a bit of an observation more than some scientific study here. And my last one here, I just kind of wanted to probably reinforce the importance of the transition period, because the key message is that we actually need to start acting now around this. This season, we already start applying nitrogen, so we probably already need to be thinking on the plan and what are we going to be doing. Because what we have observed is that farms, some of the farms we've been working with, have been able to drop significant amounts of nitrogen fertilizer use, but over 2 or 3 years. So it takes time to do it well. So we cannot wait until we just have to do it and then go for it. And in many cases, it's better to do it in stages rather than in just one go. And we have examples where people try to do it in one go, significant reductions, and didn't go well. And as the last 2 points, I'm sure David and Ant are going to reinforce that. I mean, clover has always been our friend, but now more than ever. But it needs time to really make sure that it's present in our pastures, is fixing nitrogen, and also is passing that nitrogen to the rest of the pastures. Doesn't happen just by magic and immediate. Is a bit of a period there. And then very important, we are lifting any other limitations. My microphone just died, but it's okay. I have a strong voice, my husband says, so probably just use that, my natural. So yeah, just lifting these other limitations. So this is a bit of just an observation from working with a few farmers, and now we're going to get more into, I don't know if there is any questions on this or any comments, but so happy to answer anything or bring any of your comments or experiences. Yeah, so are you asking about?
So the new 190 kilo cap is for every hectare?
Yes,
or
it
is average for the farm?
It is for every hectare.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is there any point not putting nitrogen on effluent paddocks then?
What do you think? What's the answer there? What are you guys doing? A very, very, very good question. I mean, we shouldn't be. My answer is we shouldn't be putting nitrogen if we don't need it. But is any farmer that would like to comment on that? I'd rather don't say. Is anyone want to comment on it? What is your plan? How are you going to treat the effluent areas?
We've got a 190 cap anyway per hectare, so putting less, I mean, we should be putting less on our effluent paddocks because obviously they've got available nitrogen from the effluent, but doesn't mean that you've got more to put on your other paddocks.
No, it's not. It's probably the conversations I've been having with some farmers is more about do I really crank up, use my cap, I guess, in the effluent area. I mean, in another plant, they probably would have thought about putting 170, but now I'm really going to be using my 190 and grow more there. Yeah. In that kind of behavior, perhaps is.
I mean, at a pure here at the rules, what can I do to maximise profitability on my farm? I should put 190 on my effluent paddocks and then take silage off them and feed it out around the rest of my farm. Like, yeah. The putting in place restrictive. A set of absolute rules creates perverse outcomes, as opposed to the lady at ECAM before, apologies I can't remember your name, but having an outcomes-based approach is a much better way to achieve the results. But I mean, we've got what we've got.
Absolutely, that's what we had before, outcome-based approach, and you have a few levers you could pull. Now we force into an input control, nitrogen, but also now not only is on every hectare, because before we could have really use that cap very well, not effluent areas that already has nitrogen from stock, whatever. But now, yeah, so restricts the decision making, and I think the innovation from farmers. But yeah, excellent. I don't know if there is any other comments or questions, or we move to the experts here, the scientists, which I'm sure will have all the answers. Yep.
Before about the total end use, for the average for the farms. How much of that is actually organic of all those different years? Because we've got to take that into consideration now, because we've got to take that out of the equation. I mean, I might be bugger all, but I'm just asking that question.
Yeah. So that's a very good point, because everything we've been talking about, the rules, is about synthetic fertilizer. So most of the data we have here, that I have presented, are really any nitrogen that is coming into the farm. So when we are entering data in overseer, if it is an organic source of nitrogen and is accounted there, will be in there. Same with the data from database. So it includes everything. So probably the data is not 100% there, but it wouldn't be a big proportion. But very, very valid point. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much. I will disclose straight away that I'm a North Islander, so I apologise for that. Some of my views are biased by what happens in North Island dairying, but what I want to talk to you about is when I left university, my first appointment was with MAF and the dairying land of milk and honey in Taranaki. And Muldoon was building an ammonia urea plant at the time that I was stationed there, so I was instructed to do quite a lot of nitrogen trials on dairy farms in the Taranaki area. But I want to take you back to the future, because with a limit on the amount of nitrogen fertiliser, and particularly in the irrigated South Island dairy systems, we need to return to a more clover-based sward. Now that comes with some issues, and we'll hopefully cover that in the next 9 minutes that I've got left. Okay, but let's have a quick look back in time, because I'm old enough that I can do that now. And I want to take you to the 1990s, when a number of dairy industry people, farm consultants, dairy scientists, with the Dairying Research Corporation, which was the forerunner of Dairy New Zealand, all got together and said, we want to produce more summer milk. So they had this program called More Summer Milk, and essentially what they identified was, so there's the growth curve, my hand-drawn growth curve, non-irrigated pasture growth curve. What they identified was that water and soil nitrogen was limiting late spring, summer growth, and that if they could do something about that, they would improve the overall supply of milk to the factories and so on and so forth. And so, unfortunately, water is not a viable economic option in the North Island, because we actually get quite a bit of rain at times, and so most of the work looked around how could you better employ nitrogen fertiliser to try and make up some of the deficit in that summer period. Meanwhile, here in Canterbury, you guys had irrigation, nitrogen fertiliser and grass. And so you developed a very successful dairying system around those three resources, and of course your own skills and abilities, soils and so on and so forth, and climate. But, and you did well in that you had a good system which was driven by and large by constant nitrogen supply to push that grass along, because clover wasn't really featured in your system. If water quality, if the 190 cap, and this is debatable, if the 190 cap is about improving water quality, then you guys who are using more than 190 did the right thing, because recent history would have suggested that the way that would have been managed was by benchmarking or grandparenting. But so there's your, I got ahead of myself. So there's your pasture production curve. It looks a bit different than in the North Island because you've got moisture over the summer period. But then along came Smith and Jones and basically put a cap on nitrogen fertiliser at 190, as you've just discussed. And I agree with the gentleman who was talking about, our people, fertiliser reps, consultants, etc., have been telling dairy farmers not to put so much nitrogen fertiliser on their effluent blocks because utilise the nitrogen from the effluent, etc. But that's just taken that option off the table. And so there's the cap and who will be affected, and I've got some data about nitrogen fertiliser use on dairy farms as well, which isn't too far away from what Virginia has. We had the Fertiliser Association of New Zealand had AgFirst do a report on nitrogen use in New Zealand across all land uses last year in 2019. And essentially what our data shows that for dairying, the average N fertiliser use between the years 13 and 2018 is in this table there, and that essentially 25% of all of the dairy farmers in those 5 dairying regions all exceed 190 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare to a greater or lesser degree. The issue for you is that 75% of you actually use more than 190 kilograms of N, according to our figures anyway. And so those actually align quite well with what Virginia was showing you before. So that's the challenge that we all have in front of us now. And high nitrogen use, does it actually add up? Is it economic for you to be using 300 kilograms of N per hectare? And I've pinched data from the Dairy New Zealand, and this shows essentially that the efficiency in terms of kilograms of milk solids per kilogram of N applied decreases quite rapidly, and once you get over around 200, the efficiency drops below 5 kilograms of milk solids per hectare. And Dairy New Zealand have said that if your production is less than 6 kilograms of milk solids per kilogram of nitrogen applied, then you'll profitably remove nitrogen fertiliser from your system. Obviously you have to cope with that in terms of feed demand and supply, but that's nevertheless what the data would show. This is in the handout as well, this graph that is in the handout. It shows a very poor correlation between profitability or operating profit per hectare and nitrogen use. That's not necessarily all that surprising, given that we all know there's a hell of a lot of things that go into producing a kilogram of milk solids, not just nitrogen fertiliser. But nevertheless, it's an interesting thing to ponder. And so, legumes and pasture production. I'm just going to go over some principles. Dave and Peter will tell you how they did it on Lincoln University Dairy Farm. I'll tell you principles which are founded in good research that's been going on for the last 40 or 50 years. So, a grass legume pasture is the cheapest feed you'll grow on your farm, the cheapest marginal cost that you'll grow on your farm. And so, apart from the soil resource, which hopefully is free draining, or you can change the drainage if it's poorly drained, and you have all the infrastructure there, then you need to attend to all the major and trace elements that are required for a successful, productive grass legume pasture. And this should be optimised first before you start considering anything else from a soil fertility perspective. Clovers will fix from a wide range of research between 50 and 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And a paddock that can be fixing 200 this year might be only fixing 50 next year for a whole variety of reasons. So it's highly variable. But nevertheless, it's a continual input of nitrogen into your soil nitrogen pool. Grass clover pastures don't require nitrogen fertiliser to grow because the clover is providing that, cycling through the animal, through the dead herbage and so on and so forth. But it will, and just to reinforce Virginia's point, that it can take 12 to 18 months for clover to re-establish itself through a change in system, pulling back in terms of nitrogen fertiliser use. And you may even have to introduce clover back into your pastures. This grass legume pasture will be more variable than your irrigated grass pastures. And so, matching supply with demand will be more challenging than potentially it is now. And so, as I said, grass clover pastures don't require nitrogen, but well-managed grass legume pastures will respond to nitrogen fertiliser, as everyone who's put nitrogen fertiliser on grass legume pasture knows. And I've taken a punt, an educated guess from work that's been done around the place that in a dryland situation that's growing maybe 14 to 16 tonnes of dry matter per hectare, with 190 kilograms of N, you can grow another 2 tonnes by and large. That's data from Dairy Research Corporation in the Waikato, but Taranaki as well. And nitrogen fertiliser is generally the next cheapest feed that you can generate on your farm. In an irrigated situation, if you're growing 16 to 18 tonnes, I'm picking that with 190 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, you can grow another 2 tonnes on top of that. Because we know that even if you've got everything right for your grass legume pastures, they'll always respond to a bit more nitrogen. There's always insufficiency or a deficiency of nitrogen for maximising pasture growth given environmental conditions. Pastures require about 4 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per day, less than a slow growth period. And so we can tactically use nitrogen fertiliser to meet deficits and that insufficiency of soil supply of nitrogen. Okay, so very quickly, just some principles that you need to consider when you're looking to reduce the amount of nitrogen fertiliser you're putting on your farm to maximise the efficiency of the response from the nitrogen that you do put on. Okay, timing of application. The best response you'll get from nitrogen fertiliser on a grass legume pasture is when that pasture is growing fastest. Okay, so the highest correlation of anything to do with nitrogen fertiliser and pasture response is the growth rate post-application of that nitrogen fertiliser. And that's what basically that shows, that as you move from late winter into spring, your pasture growth rates increase, you'll get the maximum response. And so it's highly correlated to the rate of growth after application. And so when in late winter, early spring, consider starting applications when the temperature at 10 centimetres is 6 degrees and rising. In summer, particularly in Canterbury, heat stress affects grass growth, and so you get less efficient nitrogen responses. So here's an area that you can consider in your farm system. Put less or none on in the January, February months, where you will get a less efficient, given that you're only constrained to 190 kilograms of N, and you want to get the maximum bang for your buck from your N applied. Don't put it on when you're not going to get the best return. And summer is a thing for you to consider in terms of the amount or the timing of nitrogen application. And then in autumn, apply while the soil temperature is still 8 degrees or above 8 degrees. Rate of application, in well-developed, you get diminishing returns on well-developed soils. What I mean by well-developed soils is not something that's just had pine trees cut off it and you've turned it into a dairy farm. What I mean is a farm that's been under pastoral grazing management for 30, 40, 50 years, because your soil nitrogen pool will have been built up over all of those years of grazing forage, dung and urine return, dead herbage return back to the soil, etc. And so we see a classic case of diminishing returns. So you're getting less and less extra kilograms of dry matter for every kilogram of nitrogen that you apply. Taking all that into account, think about applying anywhere between 20 to 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per application. Now, what rate you do apply will depend on what you believe is the deficit between feed supply and the demand at the time that the nitrogen response will have been maximised. So you have to work out what your deficit is. You have to work out, based on a 10 to 1 or a 15 to 1, 10 kilograms of dry matter per kilogram of N applied response, you've got to work out how much nitrogen should I apply to meet that deficit. Just an interesting point that I heard from a science conference quite a while ago, that 75% of the nitrogen for growth actually comes from the soil nitrogen cycling, not fertiliser nitrogen. So, you know, we're playing around with the sort of the top end of the requirement when we're putting nitrogen fertiliser into the system. The herbage massed application, this in farmer speak, leaf grows leaf. We know that pastures have a sigmoidal growth curve. You try and graze it just as it's topping off at the top of the sigmoidal growth curve. You graze it down before it goes down into the sort of lag phase, etc. So this is just what these experiments basically show, that you get a better and faster response the more leaf area you have. So you should always allow pasture to recover from grazing and apply into pastures roughly between 13 to 1800 kilograms of dry matter per hectare residual herbage mass. And in terms of grazing interval, pastures take time to respond to nitrogen. Put nitrogen on today, you're not going to get the full response in 2 days' time. You're going to get the full response in a lot longer period. Response time depends on the rate of pasture growth after you've applied it, the amount of nitrogen you've applied, and so on and so forth. But the principle here is that it takes time to respond. And so from that, allow 21 to 28 days to grow before grazing. Now, I put the tarred and feathered person up there because I suggested only 3 weeks ago to a Canterbury dairy farmer that going at 18 days round or 21 days round, which he said he was doing, to keep up with pasture growth and quality, because he applies nitrogen after every grazing. I suggested he needed to stretch that out to maybe 23 to 25 days, and he said go back to the North Island. And that's fine, but so let me get this right. You're putting on nitrogen after every grazing to grow pasture to feed your cows for the next grazing. You come back in 18 days. If you hadn't put the nitrogen fertiliser on, you wouldn't have needed to come back in the 18 days because you wouldn't have grown so much pasture. But so what I'm saying is just think about, the principle is the longer you can leave it, the more response you'll get from the nitrogen that you apply. So again, in a constrained environment where you can only use 190, you've got to get the best you can out of that nitrogen. And if you're going to cut it for silage or hay, well then leave it for longer to get the maximum yield from the nitrogen that you put on that conserved feed. And lastly, just some further points to think about. Soil health and herbage testing will be important, and you may need to do more than you're currently doing now to really optimise all of the nutrients, but also all of the soil physical properties and so on, to maximise your chance of getting the best from the pastures that you're growing. Grazing management, you'll have to think about how you can graze so that you're actually complementing clover growth. Because if you allow the grass to be too competitive relative to the clover will not thrive and fix nitrogen and so on and so forth. If there's still a mismatch of feed supply with demand when you've done all that, as there probably will be, then use nitrogen tactically as keeping those principles in mind to get the best result from the nitrogen that you apply. From spring to autumn, use nitrogen fertiliser with a urease inhibitor to reduce the chance of ammonia losses, volatilisation if it's urea you're using. And if you do that, you can use slightly less nitrogen at each application as well, because you're saving some. Okay, and this again is I'm risking myself here because the conversation I had with this Canterbury dairy farmer was, I said, well look, why don't you, as an idea, think about maximising the growth peak growth rates. Put nitrogen fertiliser on when your supply exceeds your demand, and make some silage and hay and feed it back in summer, autumn. And he said, go back to the North Island. And so just think about that, and I heard someone saying, put 190 on their effluent block and conserve it, etc. The reason he said to me to go back to the North Island was because he said it's too expensive. And it may be, but have we done the sums? What's behind my suggesting that is that we did this in farmlet trials up in the North Island, and at the time it was profitable, even with the costs of ensiling and the losses that occur between harvest and feeding out. And also consider gibberellic acid in your first and last application, because you can substitute that for some of the nitrogen that you're applying. And so if I've offended you as South Island Canterbury dairy farmers, I'm going to take the words of Sally Stanford to heart, and so if I'm being run out of town, I'll get in front and we can turn it into a parade. Thank you.
Some of the science using liquid N, there's been quite a bit of publications lately with guys using liquid N and suggesting they're using a lot less N and getting the same amount of grass growth during the season. Just your thoughts on that?
Yep, I've seen the same publications. I've also seen what little research has been done, comparing just liquid nitrogen versus solid nitrogen at the same application rate, and see no difference in the total response that you get based on the form. The interesting there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that it's more efficient, that they can use less. I think it's because they're actually probably managing their pastures better. I mean, Peter, if I can remember rightly, dropped his nitrogen applications by half in 1 year, just from one season to the next. Was that right, Pete? And you're going to tell us all about that now, I know. So if these farmers who change from solid to liquid and using less, great, that's great, I'm not knocking that, then I think it's because they were using probably too much solid in, because the research doesn't back up the claim at this point.
There's no difference in response, and if it is liquid or solid, the response is the same.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
That's what I'm saying. The kilograms of dry matter per kilogram of N that you get is the same, whether it's liquid or solid, at the same rate of application.
Because it's liquid, it's actually getting to the plant. It's more available to the plant sooner than a solid.
Right. So that is true to a degree, in that, again, the research on this shows that probably a maximum of, at the best circumstance, about 30% of the nitrogen you apply can be absorbed through the leaves. But in most circumstances, it's less than that. And so, yes, a little bit of urea, in particular, can be absorbed through the leaves. But, plants have roots for a reason, and that's because the nitrogen supply that they have without fertiliser comes from the soil. So, yeah.
So, my next question was, what's your view on applying urea pre-grazing to allow the lag time, so once it's grazed, it's available for the plant?
Yep. So that's fine, so long as it's not longer than about 4 days pre-grazing. Yeah. Which is, I think, quite a few people do that, and particularly when you're on an 18-day round. Is that right? Yeah. Don't get it longer.
Run through some information on what's happened at LUDF in the last 10 years, actually. And in that time, LUDF have been on a bit of a journey with nitrogen use. So this graph, going to Ant's points earlier, shows that back in the late noughties, around about 190 kilograms of nitrogen. Interesting. That's about where the cap is at the moment. Then the farm went through this period of high application. Actually a couple of years there where we were up around 350 kilograms of nitrogen. And then there was a transition year here in 13-14, and then a drop to some lower inputs of nitrogen fertiliser, if I got that right. Blue is the LUDF line, around about 168. So that's an interesting journey, particularly topical now that we're in this period of facing nitrogen caps and a lot of questions about how we use nitrogen and what happens in the system. So, during the lockdowns cause some changes. Without travelling and stuff so much, some of us found we had a bit more time on our hands, and I'm a scientist, and this is a bit of a sad confession to have to make, but what I did with extra time on my hand was dig into some data. Boring, eh? But anyway, LUDF data is awesome. There is an amazing data set at LUDF, and personally, I don't think that's been given enough prominence. And now is a good time to give it some prominence, to dig into it and see what it might tell us. So I got in touch with Peter, and I said, Peter, I've got all this time on my hands, I want to look at some of your data. And he kindly supplied me all the farm walk data, all the pasture quality data, and all the Hawkeye data for nitrogen and other fertiliser application on LUDF from 2010 to 2018-19. And I was like a pig in clover. I think this is a pig in mud, I should say. Something else in clover, isn't it? Pig in mud, brilliant. So I got started into that, so a big thank you to Peter. Chris Lewis is going to talk to us about Pasture Coach in a moment, help me out navigating Pasture Coach. The long and short of it is there was about nearly 2,500 grazing events that I pulled out of Pasture Coach. So over 10 years, 21 paddocks, 10 or 11 grazings a year, there's a lot of data there. There were about 1,800 fertiliser events, I think, from memory, from Hawkeye. LUDF started using Hawkeye about 2009, I think, Pete. So I was able to get Hawkeye data from 2009 that separated the farm into effluent, non-effluent areas. We could look at where the fertiliser was going, how much was going on, when it was going on, and so on. Okay, so what I'm going to look at is essentially the contrast between what happened in these really high input years here and the lower input years. Now, for many farms, you're facing a change towards a lower nitrogen under the cap that is not as severe, is not as great as that difference. But nonetheless, I think there's some messages we can pull out from looking at that difference, which help us understand how we can farm best with limited amount of nitrogen, as Ants has said, under a nitrogen cap. So bear that in mind. We're looking at quite a large change. Second point I want to make is that even if you're faced with a lesser change in nitrogen reduction from where you are now, other things do change, right? Less nitrogen, less pasture growth, that ripples through into the system in different ways. So it's important to understand that it's not necessarily just a case of pulling out some nitrogen and carrying on as usual. There's some other adjustments that have to be made in the system to keep it all straight and square. So I think this information helps us identify what some of those other adjustments might be, and we can certainly see how they were implemented at LUDF. The third point I want to make is, so to touch on some of those other adjustments, bear in mind, keep this in mind as I go through the data I'm going to talk about. From here to here, LUDF dropped stocking rate from about 3.95 to 3.5 cows per hectare. That's the first point. Second point is that the comparative stocking rate on the farm, that is the kilograms of live weight per tonne of dry matter offered, did not change. So yes, they dropped cows, but they did so in anticipation of less feed available from pasture. And we'll see what that difference was in a moment. So there was essentially no difference in the feeding of the cows, of the herds between these two phases if you use the comparative stocking rate indicator. The third point to make is that from the data I've looked at, there was no difference in the apparent efficiency of utilisation of pasture grown between this phase and this phase. It was about 84% of pasture grown was converted into pasture eaten from what I can work out. No difference between those two phases. What did happen, there was a slight increase in feed conversion efficiency in the lower input years. That is, the kilograms of dry matter eaten to produce a kilogram of milk solids went down from around about 13.5 here to about 13.1. Maybe not a significant difference, but certainly there was that's a trend in the right direction. You're getting better milk production from a unit of feed eaten, not worse. That's the first point to make in relation to that. The other point to make is that the overseer numbers for nitrogen leaching for the farm in this period went from about 45 down to about 30. So there was about a 30% reduction in estimated nitrogen leaching, not just due to the nitrogen fertiliser story, but due to the other things that happened on the farm as well. Okay, so there's the story at the high level. Ants touched on a moment ago the efficiency of nitrogen use as measured by these numbers, kilograms of milk solids per kilogram of fertiliser applied. I don't want you to go away from here thinking that each kilogram of nitrogen fertiliser you put on is going to grow you another 6 to 8 kilograms of milk solids. It doesn't. It grows you another 10 or 12 kilograms of dry matter, and that's maybe a kilogram of milk solids. The point of these statistics is they take into account all of the inputs and outputs of the farm system, and they indicate the efficiency in which nitrogen is being used in this case. And they serve the purpose of showing that the efficiency of production, which includes these higher input years here, lifted in the lower input years quite substantially. So the system moved to a much more efficient basis when it comes to use of nitrogen. So that's got to be a good thing, not only for productivity, or not only for the environment, but for productivity as well. Okay, so digging into a little bit of the detail of what happened at LEDF. So this is where the 2,500 grazing events and 1,800 fertiliser events come into play. This graph is showing two things, two lines. Orange line is the number of applications per paddock per year through that period of time, from 2011-12 to 12-13, our high input years here, and our lower input years. I'm really just wanting to compare these two boxes here. I'm not going to talk too much about this transition year, but what we saw in terms of number of applications, that's the orange line. Each paddock was getting about 10.5 nitrogen fertiliser applications per year in those high input years, and that dropped to about just a bit over 8. So there was 2.4 on average, 2.4 less fertiliser applications per year in the lower input years compared to the higher input years. At the same time, the rate of nitrogen that was going on at each application fell on average from about 32 down to about 24. So I've got to read that off against the left-hand axis. So it was about an 8 kilo drop in nitrogen fertiliser per application. So these were two of the things that led to that big reduction in nitrogen fertiliser inputs between those two periods. And if I now move to a couple of things here. So the first row is showing you what the difference in nitrogen application per hectare per year was between the high input years and the low input years. About 158 kilos less nitrogen. So what I've just shown you on that previous graph is how that nitrogen reduction was achieved. Fewer applications and less at each application. There was also a transition from moving nitrogen fertiliser out of the effluent areas into the non-effluent areas to some degree. I should put that differently. The effluent areas, the farm reduced nitrogen fertiliser application on the effluent areas. Some of that was moved onto the non-effluent areas on the North Block. And some of those paddocks on the North Block then had higher nitrogen application than on the South Block. Now that's, as we just heard in the discussion before, going to be ruled out under the new rules that we have to work under. So that's unfortunate because there was a good efficiency gain that was achieved by doing that on the farm. The second thing in this slide is the total amount of pasture grown. So estimated about 20.4 tonnes in the high input years, nearly 19 tonnes in the lower input years. It's a difference of 1.5 tonnes of pasture grown between the two phases, and that's about 9 or just under 10 kilograms of dry matter per kilogram of nitrogen applied, which is very close to the sort of figure that we assume is the response to nitrogen fertiliser in general. What I do want to add, and I haven't got this information up here, is that it's possible to look at the actual nitrogen efficiency of the LUDF farm paddock by paddock. Sorry, I'm not going to go into the detail, I'm just going to mention the number. But when I looked in these high input years at the variation between paddocks and pasture growth and the variation in nitrogen they'd received, so although they got an average of 325, in some cases there were paddocks that were getting high 300s, some were in the low 200s. So you can whack a line through that and say that's the apparent nitrogen efficiency. Ants was looking at me puzzled, he doesn't like that, I can see why. It's a crude estimate of how efficient the farm was at that time in turning nitrogen into grass. And that number was about 15. Okay, it wasn't 10, it was 15. So the farm was already working very efficiently in terms of converting nitrogen into grass. So if I took the 15 figure and multiplied that by 160 kilograms less nitrogen, that should have dropped by about 2.5 tonnes. But it didn't, it dropped by 1.5 tonnes. So first of all, we start to see something going on that was maybe buffering the amount of reduction in nitrogen-driven grass growth in the system. So the point I want to make here is that don't necessarily assume that by yanking out a proportion of nitrogen, you're going to lose all of the efficiencies or all the productivity you were getting from nitrogen previously. There are ways of getting it back. And I'm going to touch on that in a minute if I remember. So this is the growth curve. So I said the total pasture growth dropped by 1.5 tonnes. Seasonally, we saw less less pasture growth in all months of the year, pretty much. Bit of a coming together in November. But by and large, it was a consistent reduction in pasture growth throughout the year. Now I want to look then at what happened to grazing management, round lengths and so on. So here again we've got the higher input years in orange, lower input years in purple. These were the average round lengths for different months of the year during those two phases. So you can see straight away that there was a lift in average round length by about 4 days. And most likely, Peter can answer this, but most likely that's because we were growing less grass. So to get to your pre-graze covers, it's going to take a bit longer. So you're almost automatically going on to a longer round. And here's a graph that surprised me. I then looked at what did that mean for leaf stage at grazing. Now, Peter hasn't been out measuring leaf stage pre-grazing on every paddock for the last 10 years. Oh, well, if he has, he hasn't told me. But anyway, we took some information from other trial work that we'd done at the Lincoln University Research Dairy Farm, just a couple of kilometres away, where we did have information on leaf appearance rates, leaf emergence rates. So from knowing round length, knowing leaf emergence rate, we can back calculate what the likely leaf stage at grazing was. So these numbers really surprised me. Quite a proportion of the year in those high input years, on those fast rounds, we were grazing at somewhere between 1.5, 1.75 leaves during the regrowth stage. And what do we normally think we should be at? Any takers? Over 2, Richard? We often think 2.5. We talk about 3 leaf stage as being maximising growth. We're nowhere near it in that case. Does it matter? I think it does, because this extra leaf stage here doesn't look like much. It's about 0.3 of a leaf stage, but without going into the details of it, Ant's mentioned this sigmoidal growth curve pattern. What it means is you're actually grazing higher up into that more, what we often refer to as the more exponential or linear part of the growth curve. And less often are we pushing the pasture back into the early stages of regrowth where we get a bit of a lag. Some very rough numbers that I did on that difference in leaf stage suggested that probably contributed an additional 1 tonne of pasture grown in these lower input years compared to if we'd stayed on the same round length as in the higher input years. Do you follow me? So I said earlier I thought we would see a 2.5 tonne reduction in pasture grown at LUDF. We actually saw 1.5 tonne. And I think some of that difference can be related to the fact that the longer rounds allowed pasture to regrow into a higher leaf stage and capture some more of the growth potential in the regrowth curve. Pre and post grazing, this is the story in this as well. So these are how the average pre and post graze pasture covers panned out over the period. So we do see, as we kind of expected in spring, particularly with the nitrogen that was used in spring, that longer round length has pushed pasture pre-grazers a bit higher than in the previous high input years, coming together later in the season. And we do see higher pre-grazers here, we do see a trend towards some higher post-grazers as well. And that might be starting to ring some alarm bells in the audience at this stage. We are concerned about post-grazing residuals, but I think it's fair to say, even though we saw a lift here in those spring months in the lower input years, we didn't see pasture residuals getting out of control. And one of the things I would point to here is the transition of the farm from about 20% tetraploids in about 210 to about 95% of pastures in 218, 219 had tetraploids in the pasture mix. So there was potentially an enabling trend there of grass mixture and the use of the tetraploids that helped achieve, still, I think most of us would agree, a pretty good profile of post-graze pasture covers. I think the final point I want to make is there's also a fantastic set of data on pasture quality at LUDF, and again I dug into that and these are the conclusions I drew out of that data. We did see a small drop, 2% drop in metabolisable energy as measured on pre-grazed pasture under Peter's sampling regime. We also saw a drop in crude protein concentration from about 23 to 21, an 11% drop. This difference in crude protein I think we can explain by the longer regrowth interval. As grass matures through a regrowth cycle, the crude protein concentration is diluted. Older leaves are starting to mobilise some of the nitrogen in the leaf back into the plant, and you've got a better balance between young leaf and old leaf. So the crude protein concentration comes down. That's a good thing in terms of nitrogen surplus in the animal and nitrogen excretion. A drop of 2% in metabolisable energy, did it impact production? Not from what we can see from the production information from LUDF. Those cows are produced really high, per hectare production's been good. So if there were effects of that drop in metabolisable energy, they were hard to pick up in production. Now, am I doing this or are you doing that? So I just wanted to cap. So that's a bit of a deep dive into some of the things that were going on in LUDF during that period. So, you know, immediately the farm was onto longer rounds as a consequence of lower growth rates. Longer rounds were changing the leaf stage at grazing. There were some compensatory effects going on in there. The one bit of information we didn't have, which we would have loved, was the clover information. So that's a cross against you, Peter. You should have been out there doing your botanical compositions more often. But we would have expected clover to have recovered post the root weevil and with lower nitrogen fertiliser and contributing also to growth and total system nitrogen, but we can't really get a handle on that.
Excellent, thank you, David. I was thinking before we open it up for questions, perhaps having a comment from you, Peter, from a management point of view, because it was a significant change what happened in terms of nitrogen use. So, probably things like, from a management point of view, was it more difficult? What did you see in the pastures? I mean, any observations, and it's probably a long time ago now, but if you can remember anything that you can share will be great.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing is the visual side of it.
It was amazing look at a great data set, and what it didn't show, and what I'm keen to sort of hear, is what was the farm's production change, and then a separate question, which is a bit more complicated, obviously, is profitability. But if it was standardised, what was the production change and the profitability effect?
Yeah, good question. Do I need to throw that to you? There was a drop in production. I'm just remembering off the figures, Ron might have them in his head better than me, but I'd say the per hectare production of the farm probably dropped about 50 kilos of milk solids per hectare per year between the high input and the low input years. Is that in the ballpark, or is that a bit low?
Yeah, I can probably answer it at the start as well. So we did a presentation last autumn to the LED looking at our nitrogen leaching. So and there's quite a few changes going on through there, Peter, which Ron was also involved with P21. So we changed our KL numbers, lifted per cow production quite dramatically as well. So there were a number of farm system changes that happened through then. So profitability is pretty much exactly the same, if not slightly better, with half the nitrogen leaching coming out of the farm as well. So there were quite a few management levers that were pulled through there, weren't there, Peter?
My production number's a bit low. I was looking at this, it was about 18, the high input years, 1,870 kilos of milk solids per hectare. The lower input years, 1,750, so about 100 kilos milk solids less, or thereabouts.
Was there a change in silage management?
Change in silage management?
Yeah, what we've made or what we've fed out? Yeah. We've certainly noticed we've made less silage on the platform over the last 3 or 4 years, and a lot of that's probably seasonal as well, and feeding out, it depends on the season. 2 years ago we only fed 160 for the whole season. Last season we fed 400 just because of the autumn, or 400 plus. So it's very seasonal, I think. Silage made and silage fed has probably more so than nitrogen use.
About the tetraploids, how much of this do you think is a tetraploid story, and do you think you could achieve similar changes if you have mostly diploid species, or do you think, or cultivars, do you think that is the kind of major difference?
You've experienced a change.
From a management point of view, you're saying on the...
Well, tetraploids certainly allow us to be on a longer round, quality-wise for the cows. We certainly, if it was all diploid, we wouldn't be able to probably be on the long rounds that we can. Longer rounds, like 3 or 4 days, we wouldn't be able to be, because we'd lose too much quality if it was all diploid. So, yeah, having the tetraploids has certainly enabled us to achieve what we've achieved. That sort of answer. Yeah.
I just wondered if there's some diploid cultivars out there that would be similar ability, palatability, all those sorts of things.
Yeah. I mean, diploids are not diploids and tetraploids are not tetraploids. There's quite a bit of variation between them. So I'm surprised, Peter, you didn't think with diploids you would be able to get back to grazing residuals. Why do you say that? I'm just challenging you here. Why do you feel that you couldn't achieve your residual targets from those higher pre-graze covers with diploids?
You'd be able to achieve the residuals, but I think you'd be starting to lose quality. If we wanted to go into a longer round, we would have to obviously go into higher covers with the diploids, which would compromise the quality of the grass. So, yeah.
We do know there's about a 0.2, 0.3 ME difference between tetraploids as a general group and the later flowering diploids. So that can be quite significant at some times of the year. So it does need to be borne in mind. There is that quite consistently, that difference in ME density. Grant?
I remember going to a field day and you were using diploids and tetraploids with your new grass mixes. Now just wondering how that affects your longer rounds. Peter with quality.
The question.
What is it, the mix we've got? Or
Yeah, that's the question. The mixing diploids and tetraploids in the same paddock?
Yeah, so we've got the mix of the tetraploids and diploids. In the early stages, we tried to use all tetraploids, but we found the persistence of them wasn't very good. So that's when we sort of went back to the mixing the tetraploids and diploid mix, getting the benefit of both really. So pretty much every pasture on the farm there, bar one paddock, is tetraploid diploid mix, and we've got one straight diploid paddock. And I know that we do need to go into that paddock earlier. We can't let that get as high as what we can in some of our other pastures. So, yeah.
In a non-irrigated situation, which I know most people here have got irrigation, but where people are looking at alternative grasses rather than this has been a completely ryegrass topic, how do you manage? Do you need to consider that individual grass, or do you work on the theory that they are more clover friendly and the quality thing takes care of itself? How do we do that?
We've had plenty of experience in New Zealand of doing research into alternative grass species, even research into alternative grass species, and managing those grass species like ryegrass, which is pretty dumb when you think about it, because they are different. They have different relationships between pasture cover and quality and so on. So they do have different grazing needs. So that's the first thing. There'd be no way I'd suggest you lift up the principles from ryegrass-based pastures and just drop them straight into a tall fescue or coxswain-based pasture or whatever it might be. Clover content. I think there's a general belief that species like tall fescue are more accommodating of clover. I'm not sure that the data is really, really robust on that. There does, I do hear it from a lot of sources. If that's the case, that'll help compensate. If there's any negative quality attributes of tall fescue, having more clover will help. But it's a hard one to bank on. To be honest with you, it is really hard to give those clear directions for other pasture types. We've got a lot of anecdote, but very little kind of good, consistent, solid information that we could confidently take out to farmers. I say, seed company folk here might have other views, but it's a question that's coming up a lot more as we get more climate change and so on. But I think we're caught with our pants down a bit on this one.
For the last couple of years, there was a few discussions that plantain reduce leaching in the soil. So should we still stick with plantain? But now you said that probably we need to put more clover in the pasture. So we should forget about plantain completely, or what? What's your thoughts about that?
That's one for you, Peter, isn't it? No, you should not forget about plantain. Plantain is an emerging opportunity for us to improve our nitrogen footprint even further. And remember, we're talking here about an imposed cap coming into one aspect of our pasture management. There are still outcome-based regulations, nitrogen leaving the farm, that our farmers increasingly are having to meet. And the nitrogen cap thing alone won't solve it. It's going to need more, in many cases, more tools to make it work. Now, plantain is one that potentially fits in our grazing system and does some really interesting things which help reduce nitrogen leaching. It does complicate the story further because it's another plant that has to be managed within probably a ryegrass clover mixture. So it does complicate the management story. And that's an area of work that's getting a lot of attention now and over the next few years to sort that out. How do you best incorporate plantain in a mixture, get the environmental benefits, hold your productivity, and what's required to do that. So definitely don't ignore plantain, but see it as another tool that's going to be necessary to meet those outcome-based limits.